Good morning. Deaths from suicide represent not only a major and growing public health challenge, they have devastating impacts on tens of thousands of families every single year. In 2023, more lives were lost to suicide, around 49,000, than to car accidents, around 43,000 deaths. Therefore, suicide is a second leading cause of death in those from 25 years old to 34 years old. And the rates in the United States are one of the highest amongst the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, countries in rising. This was from a study from the American Institute for Boys and Men. Now, this has been a growing concern for many as depression and feelings of hopelessness continue to rise in our world. A world without God, with no hope for salvation, is a devastating world to live in. When looking at these suicide statistics, one thing stands out. It's the difference in suicide rates between men and women. Male suicide is vastly more common and widespread than that of women's. Men commit 80% of all suicide, 80%. This is an observation not to dismiss or to discredit the suffering and the depression of women, but to raise a question. Why? Why do men find themselves in such desperation that the only comfort they find is in the solace of death? Why does male depression tend to be vastly more fatal than that of women's? And what are we doing wrong? And how can we, as Christians, better love the lost and the hopeless? Society pressures men to conform to unrealistic standards of masculinity. Our culture has idealized men. Naive stoicism kills men. Now, first, I'd like to address a question that most of us are probably thinking. What is stoicism? Once I answered that, I would like to connect stoicism with the growing rates of suicide in men. I would then like to explain why this concerns us and address counter-arguments to my claim. And finally, I would like to offer a solution to this worldwide problem. Now first, what is Stoicism? Stoicism came from the Greek Stoics. They were philosophers, and they came up with the philosophy that anything outside humans' control should be considered fate, and that fate should not be our concern. Rather, our mindset and our goals should be faced and directed towards those things that are within our control. Now, this ultimately allowed the Stoics to have some control over their emotions, control over their stress, and control over their anxiety. However, what I'd like to address is not Stoicism itself, but naive Stoicism. Now, what is naive Stoicism? It is a half-read and half-understood Stoicism, and it shows itself in three ways. The first is Stoic taciturnity, in which emotions should not be talked about, in which emotions are repressed. The second is Stoic serenity, which is the idea that humans should not feel strong emotions. And thirdly is Stoic endurance, that strong emotions should be accompanied by physical suffering and endurance. Naive Stoicism is no longer just an expectation. It is a social norm. It's a way of life. This frame of thought is not simply unhealthy, it is deadly. Now that we have a better understanding of what Stoicism is, how does this connect to suicide? I would like to talk about two studies from the National Library of Medicine. The first states, males who are socialized to internalize emotions and adhere to traditional masculine gender norms tend to have a variety of maladapted physical and mental health outcomes, including depression and premature death. Now, this is a study that directly correlates the idea of naive stoicism, or internalizing emotions, to higher rates of depression in men. Another study says this: There is evidence that commonly socialized masculine traits such as emotional stoicism, which gives males an acquired capability for suicide complexion. Now, this is just another study that shows that emotional stoicism leads to higher and more fatal rates of suicide. This all stems from this unrealistic standard of how a man should appropriately express himself. Now, this is not just a way of life for many. This is a social norm. This is a gender norm. This has been placed by society over the years. The shocking truth is that men are dying at alarming rates due to emotional repression, both from societal expectations and men's self-imposed standards. Men drastically underreport thoughts and feelings of suicide, self-harm, and depression. Looking at 20 studies across North America and Western Europe, 19.7% of men, fewer than 1 in 5, had contact with mental health professionals in the year leading up to suicide. This is compared to 35% of women. This is a study from Heads Up Guys, a website directed to giving men the help they need. Now, this is not correlation, this is causation. Women are more likely to receive and seek out the help they need, while men do not admit when they struggle. They often fail to seek the help that is available to them. They struggle alone because of society's expectations. Men's lack of reporting has caused their death. Men continue to confuse vulnerability with weakness. So, what is the problem? It is underreporting. Men have a problem, and stoicism does not allow them to find the help they so desperately need. They are unable to properly deal with emotions. However, internalizing emotions does not make them just disappear. When a hose is put underneath pressure, leaks spring. Now, those leaks are not the way that the hose is designed to release pressure. In the same way, when emotions are internalized, pressure builds. Now, those emotions don't disappear. They should find other outlets to express themselves. Now, when a man internalizes emotions, they are shown through aggression, they are shown through blaming, and alcohol and drug abuse. Now, these are things that not only destroys a man, but destroys the family that he's in. A lack of emotional transparency leads men with depression to not report. And without externalizing emotions in this critical point in a man's life, no one knows how to help or when to help. Men lack proper outlooks to express themselves. Now, some would hear this and argue that depression rates state the opposite. They might argue that the rates show female depression as exponentially higher than that of men's. However, these can both be true at the same time. It is true that female depression rates are higher than that of men's. But those rates are only the half-truth. Internalizing emotions lead to a lack of reporting. Now, these rates would fail to show the correlation between male depression and that of female depression. This is just more evidence that shows the vast lack of reporting of male depression. And this is all linked to stoicism. This lack of reporting ultimately is the pathway to suicide. It is important that these statistics do not minimize this tragedy. However, many will notice the numerous options that our society has offered to men. Now, these outlets are eager to help men, and it would be easy for a person to recognize this and come to the conclusion that if all these options are open and not received, how more can our society do to help men if men are not willing to receive that help? However, the problem is not in the variety of help that is offered. The problem is the level of shame or guilt a person experiences from society when a man actually seeks that help. Although our society has improved much over these years, there is still an elephant in the room when it comes to the underlying expectations. This is a gender norm. This is what we need to correct as a society so that there would be nothing holding men back to seek the help that is so well provided. Our society, for the most part, has already responded well when it comes to veteran suicide. Our country has recognized it for the tragedy that it is. The idea that those who have served to protect this country feel isolated in it. They feel alone, as if they're an alien in their own country. This topic deserves its own paper to be able to do it justice as a horrifying tragedy that it is. But some might look at it and argue that the only reason that male suicide is so high is because the vast majority of veterans are males. Although this argument is not wrong, again, two things can be true at the same time. Yes, the wide majority of veteran suicides are committed by men. However, the rooted problem still remains. The internalization of emotion and trauma is still the fatal end to men. The fear that those around you will look differently or judge you if they knew what you were dealing with or what you have done. So yes, the problem has led to this widespread epidemic of male suicides, and it is connected to the rate of veteran suicides. This should only further the dire need to properly help those that are struggling. Now, what does this mean for us Christians? Yes, it's a problem for our society, but why does it matter to us? Stoicism is not just a gender norm. It is a confusion of God's role for males. God states, "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church." This shows that husbands should lead the family. However, if a man is struggling with depression and is unable to outwardly express it, this not only leads to the unhealthy individual, it leads to the unhealthy nuclear family as well as an unhealthy society. Men now have an unrealistic vision for what God created masculinity to be. Galatians 6:2 says, "Bear one another's burden, and so fulfill the law of Christ." This shows that God did not design emotions to be dealt with alone. He did not create men to fight battles alone. He states, "It is not good for men to be alone." That was at the beginning of time. God recognized this problem and gave us each other. God did not expect us to come to him. Instead, he entered our darkness, into our suffering, and brought healing to us. In the same way, we should not expect those suffering with depression and anxiety and thoughts and feelings of suicide to come to us. We should recognize the red flags and pursue them. So, why are men's suicide rates exponentially higher than that of women's? This is because men lack the proper outlets to express themselves when they so desperately need it. When trapped in this mentality of naive stoicism, a person finds themselves to be isolated, even though they're surrounded by people. If emotions are seen to be a burden to others, then men see personal struggles as a duty to deal with on their own. This stoicism leads men to be emotionally removed from others, not allowing for them to cry help when they so desperately need it. It creates shallow and surface-level relationships that fail to allow for any outlet of emotional expression and the processing of emotions. When a person experiencing feelings of pain or sadness, this traditionalist man bottles up those emotions. With no healthy outlet to express those wrong emotions, it turns to unhealthy outlets. Again, anger, aggression, blaming, and drug and alcohol abuse. In short, men have a problem. However, this problem is not something a man can deal with and face alone. Men are facing an epidemic of death and suicide, committing large majorities of all suicide all around the world. Yet this problem is seldom talked about and hardly ever addressed in individuals. If it is addressed, it is hardly addressed properly through the proper outlets. No one is notified, so no one is there to offer help. The problem lies in this false premise that men are made to face battles alone, that allowing anyone into those sensitive truths opens a door to hurt. However, God recognized again that it is not good for man to be alone. In a world without God, all non-Christians have some level of hopelessness. And whether or not that hopelessness has gotten to the point of thoughts of suicide, the response of Christians should be the same. We should introduce them to the hope that is the gospel. The good news that life has intrinsic value in the eyes of our Creator. So much value, in fact, that God came down and laid down his own life that ours might be spared. That is why Christians should care so much about these astounding rates of suicide. Life is precious and more valuable than we can understand. Naive stoicism not only ruins a man, but destroys his family, as well as destroys societal function. The problem starts with a corrupted gender norm and will only end when that lie is rejected. Thank you.
Thank you, Ezra. I am just so impressed with your going back and tying it to the oldest example of an idea that you could find, Stoicism. And I love that. It's wise to not assume that current problems are just something that we recently have encountered, but to look at history, see what history can teach us about that. So it shows that you're thinking long range, down range, and I just really appreciated that. My question would be something along the lines of how pervasive or how much of a problem do you see naive stoicism be in the American church evangelical context? Is this something that Christian males in the U.S. have largely adopted to some extent? And what is your opinion on how that differs from biblical masculinity?
So, I had a few questions in there. Is it mostly how is the church addressing it, and how has our society adopted it? Am I getting that right?
Yes. Do you see? Sorry, let me rephrase. Do you see the males in the church as adopting this naive stoicism viewpoint on male emotion as a gender norm? And if so, how do you see that conflicting with the biblical standard of masculinity?
Yeah, of course. I think this lie can just as easily creep into the church as it can a non-believer. In fact, Christians can experience depression just as any non-Christian. I think that's normal. We're in a very depressing world. However, the church, from what I've seen, has done an amazing job bringing that hope in. I think a lot of people recognize this as a problem, not only in the society, but in a church. However, we do have this hope that non-Christians don't have. And yeah, this idea of staying quiet when suffering, I think can very easily be adopted in the church as well. And that second question, what was that?
Yes.
How does it compare to the world's view?
how does it compare to the biblical view of masculinity?
Yeah, biblical masculinity is definitely a leadership, but not in the leadership at expense of a man's mental health. We are called to lead the family, but that's not at the expense of our life. We are told to be strong, lead the family, lead the church, but God obviously did not design us to face problems alone. He gave us each other, he gave us the church, and obviously for a married couple, their spouse and their family. So in that case, it does combat society's expectation.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
It was a real honor to hear you speak, Ezra. You spoke with a lot of poise and strength. Yeah, excellent job.
Thank you.
Can you tell me why you're so passionate about this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't get all dressed up here just to say, oh, people are dying. We've known that since the creation of the earth, since the fall. But I think in a world where there's so much hopelessness, I think talking about it and addressing it in a biblical light is so important. I know it's talked about, but I just feel like it hasn't been given the vast density that it deserves. And just definitely seeing such a hopeless world, seeing people that the only hope they have is, they live to graduate. After that, they work, and then they live to die. I mean, that's a very depressing world to be in. And then understanding the problem, the problem's sin, but it's also it's also believing that we should face problems alone. I feel like there's a loneliness epidemic, as well as depression, as well as suicide. It's a huge problem, and I'm not addressing a root cause of depression. I'm addressing unhealthy living that opens that door to suicide.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You did a wonderful job. I was really impressed. Not only did you exhibit really good speaking skills, you're pretty much blessed with a really good voice too.
Thank you.
So it came across really well. I appreciated even in the writings that I read first is you conveyed really well that you have a strong interest and care and concern for this topic. You did really well on sticking to the topic too. There's a lot of places where you can go off and chase rabbit tails, and you didn't trails, and you didn't do that. So I appreciate that. I was wondering about and I learned something too reading this. I was really up on the Stoicism and the different kinds, and so I found that interesting and educational on my behalf. But when you talk about the emotional type Stoicism, is there a way? I have a military and a law enforcement background, and is there a way that men can be emotionally stoic in those types of situations because we were trained to be that way and was part of our culture? In fact, you probably couldn't succeed without having some of that. And then also be able to exhibit other more healthy outlets and engagement techniques when you're not in that environment.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's so many areas in which, to some level, you won't be showing every single emotion that's on your face. You're not gonna, some things might be humorous. You're gonna hide the fact that you find something funny, or obviously with law enforcement, military background, as well as firefighting, they have to be very emotionally stoic. When they enter situations that are touchy, that are sensitive, they're gonna definitely be very emotionally stoic and professional, and that's a great application of professional show of emotion. However, it's the bottling up, and often you see firefighter, law enforcement, military. It's easy to bottle things up and then turn to the unhealthy expression. However, there's so many healthy expressions to show emotions that don't bottle it up and then just lead to an explosion. There's so many things, just being able to, I know military, I know people with military backgrounds, that they have their military buddies they get to turn to. They're not afraid that their military buddies will look at them any differently if they know what they're going through, if they know what they've done, because it's that they're part of the same family. They're, they know that life. And I know the same with law enforcement and firefighting, is they turn to each other because they know what they've gone through. So just finding that outlet to others that have experienced the same thing, others that know what you're going through, I think it's huge. That's a really healthy application to direct those emotions, those traumas that you experience.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was really impressed with the level of research that you put into this paper, including the 2 research studies. I'm curious, what lessons did you learn in your research as far as your methodology? Maybe it's most helpful resources or research techniques, strategies, analysis, or organizational tools, anything of that nature. What did you learn?
I learned a lot. I'll be honest, I was not an expert on suicide statistics before this. I'm still not an expert, but I know a lot more about it than when I began. Definitely, it was very shocking to understand that 80% of all suicides spanning across the world are committed by men. Men being that 50% of population, but committing 80% of suicides. I mean, that's pretty drastic, and that's really what piqued my interest in this, was seeing the problem and then asking the question of why. Why is this? What are men doing different than that of women? And really came to the conclusion that it's really internalizing emotion where nobody knows what a man's going through and how to help is huge. And I feel like depression should be addressed differently. Men and women are different, so it would make sense that thoughts and feelings of hopelessness should be addressed differently in different situations.
Thank you.
So Ezra, you said in your speech, you talked a little bit about recognizing the red flags of suicide and pursue them, and a very practical application. If you had a friend who you saw red flags and you were concerned for him, tell me as a friend, what would you do in a very practical application?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I know people who a great story was, he turns to me and says, you didn't know I was struggling with this, but really finding a community helped, and knowing how close he was to this hopelessness was huge for me, because there was no signs. And it wasn't until later that he felt comfortable enough to open up about how desperate he was for relationships, and how even he didn't know what he needed. Now, I think as a person that if I were to see red flags in a person, I wouldn't walk up and say, hey, are you depressed? I would really just pursue it as a relationship, activities, and it's the little things that you'd be surprised that show a person that you care. And my hope it would be to build a relationship where I could ask, like, hey, how are you doing? In a heartfelt way where I know that he'd answer truthfully. I think those are great ways to really show a person God's love, as well as introducing him to the church. And the church is a huge way a person finds hope, because obviously a person struggling with suicide, I mean, I can only give them so much hope without the gospel. The gospel is the greatest hope that would encourage a person to pursue life and to know the intrinsic worth in their life. Now, obviously, I can't force faith on them, but at least introducing them to a community that knows their intrinsic human value, I think is huge.
Thank you, Ezra.
Yeah.
You made a comment when you were talking about the statistics of suicide and saying that you went out of your way to say you're not an expert, and that's kind and thoughtful to say, respectful to say. But one of the things I really appreciated about this was that you were very confident and kind of bold and direct and asserting what you thought and that you believed it to be true. In this field, there's really not any experts. I've done it for 30 years, and we haven't come up with the answer. And so I really appreciate, and I think your bold voice in having more people like you put your input in. It's as valid as any of ours, and so I respect that about you, and I respect that. Thank you. Your voice and your concerns. Having said that, one of the issues that I also really liked is how you brought it out of the secular and psychiatric realm more into the Christian, Christ-centered realm, because one of the problems is, at least in my profession, the vast majority, we look for answers in a very secular way, and it doesn't really address hopelessness that much. There's still this gnawing hopelessness left. So I appreciate that you tied in the most important aspects, and I hope you continue to pursue and voice your concerns. I think you have a place in the community to voice yourself.
Thank you.
Ezra, is there anything that you would study as you further develop this subject? Is there anything that kind of fruit left on the tree, if you were to continue developing this? What would you go back and do more research on?
Definitely, I stated that there's a lot of resources open to men. I'd like to research what those are and how those can be better tailored in the perspective that men and women are different and their hopelessness stems from different things. I'd like to research how different outlets can be tailored to that of men and better help them find the help they need in a way where they don't experience shame or guilt from chasing help, as well as just, what options are open to men, I think would be huge to be able to study.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You focused primarily on Stoicism being a large factor in suicide. Do you think that there's any other factors that maybe you could have touched on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I didn't touch on roots of depression. I more touched on once a person is depressed, how do they deal with it? There's so many reasons why a person would come to that point where they are depressed, and they're just really needing purpose in their life. There's a lot of reasons. I would have enjoyed touching on those topics, and obviously there's a lot of things that leads to a person finally coming to that point of suicide. Stoicism, naive Stoicism specifically, is what I found to be the biggest contributor, is feeling like you should face it alone, or finding shame in having the issue in the first place is huge, because number one, nobody knows when to help or how to help, but also you get in this spiral of I'm alone. And when a person's depressed, the worst thing that they should feel is alone. And that oftentimes comes from internalizing emotions and not telling anybody and not showing. Not only that, but those other expressions of emotions, such as anger and aggression and drug and alcohol abuse, those just further to destroy a man's life, and ultimately just leads him farther and farther into depression. Yeah.
You did a good job tying it back to Scripture with the bearing one another's burdens tie-in. Can you think of other examples from Scripture that would be kind of examples or models for men as far as being vulnerable, and in a way that is not just weakness, but maybe even biblically commanded weakness.
Yeah, I mean, greatest example, Jesus, obviously. I'll make a few more, but Jesus himself, he didn't show that he was strong. He came in a body that looked weak to a lot of people, and he expressed normal human emotions such as grief and anxiety and stress. Those are all very real human emotions, even to the point where he sweated blood. He was terrified and horrified, and that shows that it's okay to feel fear. It's okay to feel anxiety. He also felt anger, but healthy, righteous anger. You see it at the temple. But also we see that in David, him and his relationship with King Solomon's son. Jonathan, thank you. I mean, that just shows a real, just raw relationship between, two people. And I think it's great to model relationships after that, just being real and being able to go through hard things and admit when they're hard and admit when people are having a hard time. I think those are both really great role models when looking at proper human relationships and how those should be modeled.
Great answer. Those are some great examples. David, really good example. I mean, Psalms is filled with emotion. What would you say is, or could you pick out a difference, maybe, between how a Christian would approach someone struggling with depression, suicidal ideation, versus the way the world recommends approaching a person? Both employing the same strategy of vulnerability, getting the person to talk about their experience, drawing them out. But what would be the difference?
The world loves solving problems with medication, saying, feeling depression, here's some medication. Let's dull it down. Let's act like it's not normal. But no, God made emotions. Emotions didn't come after the fall. Christians address it for what it is. It is, raw emotions, but it should be addressed differently. It shouldn't be alienated, and it shouldn't be dulled down. It should be addressed with what it is. It's okay to feel emotions. It's okay for things to be hard, but ultimately, if you are experiencing hopelessness, we have a solution. It's through the Bible, it's through the gospel, it's through intrinsic human value in the eyes of our Creator.
Thank you, Ezra.